Well, when I relented under Shahzad Bashir's relentless arm twisting, I was at first afraid that I was going to be in over my head because I'm a complete layman as far as Islamic studies are concerned. My only familiarity with it has to do with Cornel Fleischer and Kaya Shaheen, on whose dissertation committee I was. But since I read the papers, I was no longer afraid about understanding it. Now I'm afraid about being able to finish on time. So I let my stopwatch go so I can keep track of the time. It was a pleasure to read these papers. It's a pleasure to be here. It's very interesting to hear these excellent papers and the excellent comments on them, to read them in advance and to have a sense of what is going to come, and to learn a whole lot, and not as hard to follow as I was afraid, even though I don't know the languages. And that I really miss. Not being able to follow the languages is a problem, even if the concepts show up only here and there. What I'd like to do in these comments is to proceed in 3 steps. First, I'd like to establish a common perspective on both of these papers, and I think a perspective that I found useful in thinking about all of the other papers, because there is something, I am convinced, that all of us in some sense share in this conversation, and I'd like to identify that. Then I will speak about each paper, and then I would like to conclude with a few specific points. And if I'm lucky, I won't even need 20 minutes, but I don't know. So what is it that we share? What is this basic problematic? Well, for that purpose, in order to illustrate that problematic, I gave you the handout. I'm not going to comment on all these quotations. There are a whole series of things. They all revolve around the same theme, and I leave it to you to puzzle out which way they relate to the same theme. I'd just like to draw your specific attention to the line from No Country for Old Men, which is one of my favorite lines on the second page, because we've spoken about temporality when Chigurh is at the gas station and asks the attendant, "What time do you close?" And the proprietor says, "Now, we close now." And Chigurh says, "Now is not a time. What time do you close?" Now, I'm going to read this quotation from Rashri's. It's the only other quotation I'm going to read at the beginning, because it's in straightforward language, and you may be puzzled at first and not see how it relates to what we've been talking about, but perhaps you'll see it right away, because it's very straightforward. Rashri's a student of Wittgenstein, didn't publish very much except letters and essays, but a very influential executor of Wittgenstein's will and a very good interpreter. We should mistrust any statement about what is, quote, in the interests of education, end quote, if the speaker had no experience of educational work himself. And this holds generally of activities and movements. There is no one who is qualified to speak on behalf of all. And it is humbug for anyone to advocate something, quote, in the interests of all. To say that everyone has a responsibility to society may be taken to mean that everyone ought to show a regard for the interests of society. And in this case, I think there is confusion and often dishonesty. There is dishonesty because this is generally a way of advocating certain particular interests, perhaps the maintenance of public order, a general rise in the standard of living, for example, in money incomes or in real incomes, even though various people or various sections in society would say that these things are less important than other things or other activities to which they are devoted. It will not do to say that these people are setting their own interests against the interests of society. They are setting their own interests against the interests of those who are opposed to them. That is all. Nor can it be said that, quote, society could not go on if people insisted on pressing sectional interests. That is how society does go on. One of my favorite lines in all of these writings. That's the common ground that I believe we share. And that's the common ground that is for some reason so difficult to articulate, maybe particularly in Islamic studies. I don't know. It is certainly difficult to articulate between medievalists and modernists in European history, because for some reason we feel compelled to disjoin modern secular reason from medieval religion, superstition from science, and you know all the terminology, secular from religious. I don't need to repeat that. That goes through endless variations, where you find the same thing and the same problem, which is a disjoinder of things that really belong together. Private and public is another one of these disjoinders. And what we find difficult is to look beyond that, because we, meaning the modern West, if one may call it that, has the conviction that the distinction between public and private and the distinction between rational and religious, or medieval and modern, or civilized and barbaric, is a universal distinction. It applies everywhere. And it doesn't. It's a distinction that was drawn by what you may, in world historical terms, call a sectional interest, a European interest. Europeans thought in those terms and have imposed those terms on the rest of the world. And if we want to get beyond that, we have to be able to recognize that this language is a sectional language. It is an interested language, and there's nothing wrong with that. There is no other way to talk. That's what I loved about this quotation that I quoted earlier today in my first remarks, because it really attracted my attention. Where the point is made that everybody talks from their own point of view. There is no other way of talking. And if you want to get rid of talking from your own point of view, from your own interest, then you're left talking about nothing, because nothing can be said in history that is absolutely true. And if you try to prove the absolute truth, you will have nothing to say, and you won't be of use to anybody. So that is the shared ground, as it were, which in a sense is precisely not a shared ground, but a ground over which conflicts arise that consist of different interests. And there's no denying that those interests may conflict in such a way that society does not go on. There is such a thing as civil war, after all. The fabric can fall apart. That's a possibility. That's a real possibility. Now, it seems to me that both of the papers on which I was supposed to comment and will now comment deal with this issue in a slightly different way. Nils Riecken's paper deals with this issue by focusing on a particular person, Abdallah Laroui, about whom I was very interested to read. I did read up on Wikipedia that he was a prolific Moroccan historian and novelist, born in 1933, still alive and very active. Now, Niels's central claim, as I understand his paper, is that in order to understand Laroui, we have to deal with the problem that I just tried to articulate, because the common understanding of Laroui is thwarted by this familiar dichotomy between either true Islam or secular reason, either conservative reactionary or progressive liberal Marxist. And he, as I understand him at any rate, and you can correct me later if you want, tries to undercut that. Because as long as these dichotomies occupy the debate, it doesn't matter which of the two sides you occupy, because both of these sides fail to do justice to what Laroui is actually talking about. Both, as he calls it in a very good bit of terminology, I think, both are guilty of a romantic desire for unity or heroic overcoming or identity. And it doesn't really matter whether this heroic overcoming of the disjunction and disruption of the experience of time, because there are sectional interests that actually do conflict with each other, if that happens in terms of the essence of Islam and theology, or if it happens in terms of secular modernity that seems to be incompatible with Islam. Both fail to grasp what Laroui is talking about. He borrows this term about the heroic overcoming, the romantic desire for unity and identity from David Scott, and opposes it to what he calls a tragic temporality, tragic because it recognizes and privileges the disjunction in the experience of time. And then he goes to exemplify that, this concept of a tragic temporality, with a very close and sympathetic reading of Laroui's treatment of Islam. Now, the details are complex, and I have to admit I couldn't follow all of them, in part because I don't know the language. I lose track of where how are these terms related to each other in the details. In the principle, I think I understood it reasonably well, and I would put that understanding like this. Tradition, the way Laroui talks about it, is never a given. We think of tradition as something that is fixed, but it does come, after all, from the Latin word for transmitting something, handing something over. It's a gift. And where nobody is accepting the gift, no gift has been given. Somebody has to give, somebody has to take. Or as my colleagues used to say when I was trying to make progress in my department, you got to give in order to get. It's worth remembering. It's like data. Data are not fixed. All scientists know that. Historians sometimes forget it, more likely than scientists. They're not fixed. And tradition is not fixed, because tradition is always at one and the same time past and present. It is laying claim to the real truth of Islam, but it can only do so if it stays alive in a specific contemporary setting. That means that religion and secular reason are both involved in this. And the clearest terminological clarification of that I could see, according to my understanding, and again, you'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, is in the opposition between hadith, is that right, and fiqh? Fiqh, okay? This opposition, which leads to what I thought was a really lovely save of Ibn Khaldun from the figure of being the progressive person who can anticipate modern secular reason and modern development, the first sociologist, the founder of sociological thinking, rather than understanding him as an Islamic theorist and intellectual who approaches the study of history and society from a grounding in Islam that is both religious and secular, because you need both. The hadith, the saying, the thing that is the same, that stays the same, but that is meaningless unless you apply judgment. You have to make a judgment. Whenever you use a word, whenever you use a term for something, whenever you say, this is that, you've made a judgment. That's what it means to make a judgment, not just in court, but in naming things. So the real struggle is therefore never with the tradition, but within the tradition. That's where it really takes place. And one of the reasons why I think I find that easy to accept is because I started in philosophy, and in philosophy I was taught explicitly that the only way you can make serious progress is by engaging with the tradition, by criticizing the tradition. First you got to master it, then you criticize it. Can't make progress outside of the tradition. So the central question always is, what is the tradition? And a convincing answer always requires both the judgment and the hadith, the saying that stays the same, and the application to the present. So if I understood the paper correctly, this is how Laroui sees Islam, as Sunnah properly understood, as capable of change within the tradition. And it is this understanding of Islam that escapes from an understanding that reduces Islam to pure theology or dismisses Islam as mere tradition. It is neither pure theology nor mere tradition, but it is a normative tradition. Now, Rian Thum comes at a similar problem, the way I understand him at any rate, comes at a similar problem from within Islamic historiography, contemporary Islamic historiography. And he identifies it with a debate between, in generic terms, you might call it realists and idealists, or materialists and idealists, or in medieval terms, nominalists and realists. It's an old debate. And here it is exemplified by one side, Qurani, who maintains that Islam is what Muslims believe it is. And the other side, typified by Ahmed, who maintains that Islam must have some kind of real core. Can't just be whatever they say it is. It can't be, because then anything goes. There you have, it's a typical exposition of this split. Either it's going to be anything goes, and you just let people say whatever they want to say, and you've got no Islam left, or you have, there's got to be, in essence, something essential about Islam. And neither one of those alternatives work. One can see the merits of both sides, and they loosely reflect the terminology of what Nils called the sovereign gesture of rejecting the past, of rejecting tradition, and theological essentialism. One side, the sovereign gesture is anything goes, and the other side, the theological essentialism, tries to grasp the essence of Islam, even if it's only Islam light, as I think I read at one point, or a Goldilocks kind of Islam, which is a nice way of getting under that particular skin. Now, having set up this problematic, what I understand Rian to have been doing is to ask, what exactly is the place of self-ascribed Islam in the history of Islam? What do we do with people who call themselves Muslims, even if in one way or another their understanding of Islam conflicts with other people's understanding of Islam? Can this be the real Islam? If they ascribe it to themselves, and in particular, if it is such an extreme case as the one on which he focuses, mostly, and that is the case, the extreme case of the Chinese Chen Dai-hui of Fujian, I don't know how to pronounce it, but you can correct me on that, who was studied by Drew Gladney, and who, again, if I understood it correctly, for a long time were unique in not using either the term Muslim or the term Islam in identifying themselves. Until, ironically, I'm not sure I got that correctly, but I think I did, until ironically, later on, maybe late 19th, early 20th century, they began to refer themselves that way on the basis of publications, printed books, that were written for non-Muslims in order to explain to them what Islam is about. So this, kind of ironic reversal, this is the basis on which these Muslims who didn't used to call themselves Muslim learned to call themselves Muslims and to refer to Islam in a way that was initially designed for non-Muslims, so they could figure out what that was, as if they had not known what Islam was before they learned that from these books, as if. Now, working through this example, Rian concludes that self-ascription is not merely nominal, but is historical. And there's a difference between being nominal and being historical. It's not just what they say, because self-ascription rests on three particularly important phenomena that include the transmission through history, historical transmission, that also include conversion, because there is such a thing as ascribing Islam to yourself by converting to Islam, and not just accepting it in a tradition, but embracing it individually. And then third, the effects of both, the effects of transmission and the effects of conversion. These all enter into history, and these are not merely nominal characterizations of Islam. For his main theoretical conclusion, he uses Greg Denning, also a figure, I haven't read David Scott, I haven't read Greg Denning. He uses Greg Denning's concept of a texted past. He distinguishes the history of Islam as what happened in the past from a history that consists of the past transformed into a text, and uses this term, the texted past, in order to reconcile with one another the supposedly real essence of the past that is out there and the supposedly purely nominal text that is just words about the past. The second, I think, is main conclusion, even though it comes sort of, it's not particularly accented, at least not for me. It didn't strike me as particularly accented, but my eyebrow sort of went up when he said was that this is directed against the domination of Islamic history by students of the Middle East, which clearly does not please him, because he wants people to recognize that Islamic history goes way beyond the history of the Middle East, and he points out that it excludes, simply in terms of populations, at least a third of Muslims in Southeast Asia and Sub-Sahara. So it seems to me that with this concept of a texted past that can reconcile with one another, the idea of Islam as whatever they say it is, and the idea of Islam as somehow defined, he reconciles them with each other in a way that reminded me of what Nils Riecken writes about Laroui. It's a similar place. And the reason why it is a similar place, I would suggest, is because the problem is a problem that this is really a universal problem. Maybe it's a negative universal problem or a situated universal problem. Maybe it's not even the problem at all, but it's certainly a reality because human beings can speak. And that's where it originates. We can speak. And whenever we speak and have something to say, what we say is new. In context, whatnot. It's a new thing. But the words we use are old. They're the same words countless other people have used before, according to rules that are firmly established in the grammar of our language, whether we know those rules or not. So simply in the act of speaking, there has to be a dialectic between repetition of the same and occurrence of something new. And you have to have both for language to make sense. If you want to say something meaningful, you can't merely repeat the words, because then you wind up with meaningless rote repetitions. And you can't just make up language de novo out of whole cloth, because then people won't understand what you're saying. You have to do both. That's where the problem originates, because at any moment, that situation can threaten unsettling an understanding, because maybe you're saying something so new that people don't want to hear it. I mean, some people get extremely upset. They can go apoplectic over saying such a thing as, I wonder to who that is useful. It's not to who, it's to whom. There's an M there that belongs there. And some people, literally, I mean, maybe not with that particular phrase any longer, but you know what I'm talking about. There is this kind of phenomenon where people get furious when you violate the rules that way, because you're not paying your respect to the essence of language, and you're undermining all of society. And if everybody were to do that, then the whole society would collapse. That's how people think. That's the reason why we always come back to this problem in one way or another, and that's the reason why we need to be able to step out of the European temptation to confuse one particular approach, and not a very happy approach as far as I'm concerned, to this alternation, to this duality between the old and the new, the repetition of the same and the saying something new. We have to be able to step out of that, because that's been dominant in European thinking for now half a millennium or so, in order to be able to do justice to our present time, in which very different kinds of groups are coming together and need to learn to understand each other with a language that is more suited to that kind of understanding than what we have at our disposal. The alternative, real or nominal, is simply a false alternative. And one needs to be stepping away from that because it's normal. I've used up 22 minutes. I want to say a couple more things to both Rian and Nils, because I would say that since this is normal, I would encourage both of them to go a little bit further than they have gone, because it strikes me that in some sense they're still overly respectful of this terminology, of this way of thinking. With Rian, I found it only in one spot, and the spot where he said that, asking, what is Islamic history and is it worth doing, raising the question, and says, well, Islamic history has an obvious inherent value, to which my response is, no, it doesn't. It doesn't have an obvious inherent value. You say it does, and you've got good reasons for saying so, and I think few people in this room would disagree. These are the people who share your interests, and that's all there's to it. You think it has value, so stand up for it and defend its value and speak for it, without claiming that everybody has to agree the value is inherent. It has nothing to do with what Ryan Thum is saying. To Nils, what really struck me was that at a number of points I found Albert Laroui's quotations easier to understand than your prose. You invoke a blizzard of technical terminology, and that's a very familiar device. Academics are very vulnerable to the temptation to use that kind of terminology because it's a very good defense. And I suggest to you that you don't really need that much defense. You have a really very good point to make, and you can make that by rejecting theological occupation of Islam and dismissal of Islam by the sovereign gesture without having to deploy all of that armature. And the second point is, I would ask whether this temporality has to be tragic. It certainly can be tragic, because there is such a thing as civil war. But I would not be happy to say that it has to be tragic, because sometimes things do work out, and people with conflicting interests manage to get along with one another. And I suspect that in some way there is the danger that behind the terminology of tragic temporality hides an inversion of the romantic, happy overcoming of the problem, so that the one is reflective of the other and in some sense continues the problem that you're trying to overcome, but not romantically. I've used 5 minutes too many, so I'm going to stop right now.
Thank you. So, Rian and please come. So we're going the order of the listing? Yeah. Okay, so first Nils.
Yeah, first, thank you, Shahzad, and thank you, Constantin, for this engaging with my paper and this act of translation, also by... sorry. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. So thank you for this act of translation, I would call it, and this is always also what I'm engaging in the paper, a translation of Laroui's works in Arabic and in French into English through my German and English thinking head. And so, and also applying this, maybe starting with that point close to the end of your response, this blizzard of terminology. I think for me this is a way of distancing my own, distancing myself from my own presuppositions and the presuppositions Laroui works with. So to have an optic, like using Scott's reading of Hayden White, an optic that allows me to see maybe other things or to see a certain logic working in his texts. And in this way to connect Laroui's text or his arguments with larger debates, for example, in Euro-American academia, which is a difficult enterprise to translate so-called non-Western theory into debates in Euro-American academia. And this is, for me, a way of trying to develop an optic that allows me to do that. But I take your point, so thank you for and I appreciate that you say, well, I've actually pointed enough, I don't need that, but I think it was a way for me to get to that point where I can talk about his concept of tradition in a way that avoids the pitfalls that inevitably come up when you talk from my place of speaking about the concept of tradition regarding a Moroccan contemporary intellectual who responds to Muslim theologians in Morocco and the Arab world, to other contemporary Arab intellectuals, and also to a certain hegemony of what we call Western modernity, and the renderings of tradition in these discursive practices. And I think this terminology, this optic that I use with Scott, served me to work out the particular difference he reads into the concept of tradition regarding these discourses or discursive practices he engages with. So now back to the beginning of your comment. I think I appreciate very much that you brought out this point about conflict. I think that is a key concern for me to, through invoking the tragic, to emphasize the role of conflict in Laroui's view of tradition, that he reads conflict back into tradition, which is in a way occluded in the theological readings and the secular liberal readings of tradition he engages with and I engage with. So to take conflict at the basis of the grounding of the social, because tradition is in a way, or how I approach it with Scott, is that what interests Laroui is how tradition and accounts of tradition ground the present in a certain historicity, so that a certain way of linking a past with a present and a future. And the way you spell out tradition following a certain historicity determines the way you historicize the present, his Moroccan present. So either you determine it as a certain Islamic present or Western modern present, a Moroccan present. So it's this question of the historical series you're establishing through the terms you invoke. And so, for example, what I was trying to bring out by calling this a tragic temporality is that his point is not to say, well, let's get away from these theological readings of tradition and from liberal readings of tradition, and let's do something new. So the present for him is not a place of liberal free choice or a direct access to a practical program of political action, but it is highly determinated, and that has to be worked through. And it's in that sense that no concept or no practical solution, and he's basically interested in a rationale for political action, is never finished. And I think to bring out this sense for the unfinished, this always being unfinished, that's what I'm trying to get at with by using this term of the tragic. Not in the sense of pessimism, but more in a sense, in a certain sensibility of temporality and historicity that things with teleologies and eschatologies, but things also beyond them, and rejects their ways of historicizing or offering narratives of the social or the present based on something that is taken as finished and determinate, like tradition or modernity as something reified. So I think that's for me a major point, how he reads conflict back not only in the concept of tradition, but through that into the notion of the present and his present. Second point, I don't know how much time I have left.
You have about 4 minutes.
Okay. That through this dialectic movement between hadith, or the vision of truth, history, time of the hadith sciences, geared towards preservation of a memory, of a tradition, as opposed to fiqh, the Islamic jurisprudence, concerned with the new, like the logic of the fiqh being or expressing a concern with the new, with the case, with the material, with the conflict that has to be solved, and you can respond to the new in two ways. His argument would be you can either fold it into something that is taken as given, an analogy with the past, or you somehow open your view or you to the new as a material event, and that connects to these discussions we had on the event as a rupture and materiality. So he opposes in a way the vision of the hadith with the preservation of meaning and memory to the emphasis on materiality and the event as a material event in fiqh, because jurisprudence is concerned with cases, with concrete cases and social conflicts, and finding and having to make a judgment in concrete cases. Now, what I'm just trying to show is that this dialectic is not for him specifically Islamic, because he doesn't start by saying, well, let's look what is specifically Islamic or what is Islamic historiography, but he takes a certain body of historical thought and asks what makes this body of historical thought Islamic and what produces this idea of the Islamic or the Islamic tradition in this body of historical thought. What are the epistemic conditions for this discourse to create this vision? And there he identifies this dialectic that he interprets as an expression of an antinomy within the concept of history between the creation of continuity on the one hand and discontinuity on the other hand, as a dialectical relation, as a dialectical relation, we can trace across history. And he does that in a particular field. So he wants to get away from these ideas of what is specific for Islamic history, but he tries to insert it into a more general, into a universal problematic of historicity and human action. And tradition is there a mode of that constantly can emerge in the present. It's not something of the past, but it's the creation of continuity can constantly emerge here now, not only in religion, but also in politics, in science, as he points out. And it's a way of reworking temporalities around a foundational event. And in that way, he kind of normalizes what the Sunnah does and tries to insert it into a larger discussion about the concept of tradition. And that brings me to my last point, because that came up repeatedly. His approach, if I characterize it in my paper and other earlier papers, as a situated universalism. What I mean by that is that this constant movement beyond a certain historical archive, beyond a certain body of historical thought, while determining the limits within this body of historical thought, or trying to delimit it, but not then positing something as universal in the sense, okay, now we have the authentically Islamic here, or the authentic definitive understanding of the human, but always to keep the figure of the universal open again, to think with existing articulations of the universal for example, in Western modernity and in the Sunnah, and think with them towards another possibly wider articulation of the universal, which is not fixed and can never be fixed. And this is like this figure of thought of a negative universalism, or a situated universalism that always has to continue this movement of self-reflexivity and tries to get away from a mode of thinking that works with anchoring itself in something stable. That says, well, some things are stable, and this is a huge discussion on the Islamic tradition, that people say, well, there's the stable and there's the changing. And this is a very influential distinction that, from his reading we can problematize. So, yeah, time's up, so thank you.
Thank you. And Rian?
Well, thank you very much for that kind reading. The last thing I expected to come out of your comments was to suggest that I be more bold. I was not reluctant at all to take up this topic when I was sitting in front of my computer alone looking at Shahzad's invitation, but then became more reluctant as the date got closer. But in the end, I decided that the question of how we delimit our subject of study gets avoided a lot, because I think people think to address the question somehow necessitates some kind of naive, mechanical engagement with details. The paper always comes out a little too on the nose, and so we end up letting some important details get not very much discussed, including the major attacks on the self-ascription model, most prominent one, I think, by Talal Asad, where he basically doesn't explain why he doesn't like it. He does it in about 5 sentences. So I thought I would jump in, and you found some fissures which might explain why I was okay with doing that. When you asked me to be more bold, you pointed out my claim that there is an inherent interest in talking about Islamic history, and you also noticed my discomfort, or no, not discomfort, my annoyance with the Middle East-centered understanding of Islam or Muslim societies. which Shahab Ahmed, who is the foil in this paper and the inspiration for the title, expanded a little bit to the Balkans, to the Bengal. So what both of these things point to is that there are real-world consequences of these categories. And perhaps it's a false binary, the essentialist, nominalist binary. And indeed, I tried to give a little essence to ascription through some very broad reading of various Islamic histories. But it's not false when it happens to you. I would say that the Middle East-centered understanding of what Islam or Islamic history is very much at the root of essentialist views of Muslims as foreign in all of the places where they are minorities, and that includes China, where right now, in the last year, about 5% of the Uyghur, 10 million strong Uyghur minority has been imprisoned in so-called re-education camps on the basis of their ethnicity and on the sense that their Islam is a foreign Middle Eastern Islam. So I think that's what maybe encouraged me to pursue what is, yes, maybe a very old dialectic or binary, but it's one that really, I think, plagues the study of Islamic societies today, and it plagues real Islamic societies today. Another thing that I will probably add if I continue working on this paper is the disentangling of two questions of defining Islam, which seem to be taken up always together without much distinction. One is, where do we draw a line and say what is Islamic and what is not? And the other is, what is the nature of whatever we call Islam? We could call it the question of delimitation and the ontological question. And these tend to get addressed at exactly the same time and cause a lot of confusion. I was trying in this paper just to go with the delimitation, which indeed I think comes out to be a somewhat mechanical exercise, but one we have to engage in if we're going to have a special issue on the Islamic pasts. Most notably because Islams have not only differed across time and space, but they have differed not only in their nature, but in what category they are. So, for example, we could think of like a very secular Islam where there's a sense that Islam is a religion and it's only a certain part of the human experience. And then we can imagine some idealized pre-modern Islam where it's all-encompassing, it's everything in your life. Do we really want to, any attempt to pin down Islam ontologically is going to have to get rid of one of these or the other. So I was looking for a way to accommodate all the sectional interests while being able to still speak from the sectional interests. And I guess in doing so revealed my own sectional interests, which you very keenly spotted.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. I guess, yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I think we're going to follow the procedure we learned in the last panel. So just to and go one by one rather than multiple questions. So we'll just start on this side. So Nancy.
Thank you very much. And I especially want to thank you, Professor Fasolt, for that beautiful formulation about when we speak, what we mean is new, but the words are old. And I found that to be a very clear but profound way of articulating the problem of reconciling human agency with tradition and the way people engage in tradition in a self-conscious way. I feel, though, that the problem that was posed in Ryan's paper was asking us to get to a point where it was difficult to sort of stop there. And I wonder if anybody on the panel could help me think through this. And I started thinking about the analogy of the thing on a computer that we used to call a mouse. And the reason it was called a mouse was because it resembled one physically. It was mouse-shaped and it had a wire. And then it stopped having a wire, but we still called it a mouse. And everybody knew what that meant. They knew we didn't mean a little animal with, gray fur and ears. But it's no longer called a mouse, it's called a trackpad now. But it behaves like a mouse, like a computer mouse. And so you have the idea of the word is being evoked, it means something new, but then it stops being the same word. It's a different word, but the new word does the same thing as what the old word used to mean something. And I started thinking, okay, so that's how traditions change. It's still operating the same way within the tradition of the computer, the system of the computer, but it's called something new now. And I wonder, does it matter that no one will ever remember that it used to be called a mouse? Everyone will think it was just a trackpad. If there's no one left to remember the old thing, then it doesn't matter that the tradition has now evolved so far beyond the bounds of what used to be considered Islamic to something that, let's say in the 7th century or the 8th century, Muslims could never have looked forward and foreseen that this particular festival in, Sri Lanka or wherever is Muslim too, right? But it doesn't matter because there's no one anywhere to remember that. Except for the fact that tradition is recorded and people engage with recorded tradition in a very self-conscious way. So this thing about delimitation and the thing that we call Islamic, I think part of what's difficult about it for me to wrap my head around, though I'm inclined to agree with the conclusion you came to, Ryan, in the paper and opt towards the more expansive, is that there's something about the passage of time and how tradition is fossilized through its being recorded and constructed as tradition at the same time that it is being undermined and evolving all the time because of the idea that every time we speak we mean something new even though the words are old. And so it's that point of tension that I wonder if there's any way that people have thoughts about resolving. And I'm sorry for the long and weird analogy.
Would anyone like to?
Oh.
Sure, yeah. You go ahead if you want.
I'm not sure if I fully understand you. You said that you're inclined to, go with this expansive delimitation, but there's this thing. So I don't understand. Do you think it's a problem to this phenomenon of fossilized, things being recorded in one moment and continuing to have some sort of agency in later moments?
I think it's the paradox between tradition being fossilized but also always alive that causes people to feel that there's a problem in saying anything Muslims do is Islamic. Because the logical question that comes is, what if what they're doing is antithetical to what lots of other Muslims are doing? And so there's something about that perceived slippery slope that is embodied in the paradox of something being traditional, but also always potentially subversive because it is alive and humans are doing it.
Maybe I can add or say something about that. What you were just saying, or when you first formulated your comment and question, I think that's exactly, I heard the dialectic that I was talking about in what you were saying about the mouse and the trackball. So that is one thing. So, and the other thing is, for me the question is also, why are we asking this question, what is Islamic? What is our problem space, to speak this about? And that is political, because it is about the grounding. And this very question touches upon ontology. If we say this thing is, so I think that would be also a point to be explored further then, because we could also talk about what pushes people to identify certain things as Islamic or not, and then get at the politics of it.
Constantin, please. The way I would comment this is by saying that why does this become a problem? Well, it becomes a problem when people disagree with one another or don't understand one another. And that's always concrete, and that's life. And we're talking about these things because people have very different views of what Islam is, and they have very articulate positions about what it is or isn't, and they are not the same. So there is a real disagreement. That's why one has to talk about it, because otherwise we don't know what we're talking about, we don't understand each other. And to establish a consensus on something that is so passionately debated is just a very difficult process, and sometimes it fails. That's what the quotation of what McDowell is about. Sometimes you wind up at the point where you say, don't you get it? And the other person says, no, I don't. And that's the end of it. You just don't, you can't go any further than that. And then the question is whether you come to blows or don't come to blows. What I would like to stress, however, is that in order for such disagreements to be possible, there needs to be a lot on which we agree. There needs to be a whole range of phenomena that are beyond debate, which we don't even assume. One of my models for that is a wonderful passage on religion and society in Lucien Febvre's great old book on the problem of unbelief in the 16th century, where he points out the important thing about religion in the 16th century is precisely not what people were thinking about. You have to pay attention to what they were doing without thinking about anything, not what they were thinking about. The moment you focus on what they're thinking about, you're going to be in the realm of theology. And what do ordinary people in the 16th century have to do with theology? This shows up in your paper, by the way, because there was another thing that I wanted to comment on, and that was the difference between it's whatever they say it is and it is what they believe it is. That's a fundamental difference, and that needs to be commented on, because saying what it is an action. It's a deliberate action. You say, this is what it is. What you believe can be completely, you don't even know what you believe. People will ask you, do you believe that? And you go, I suppose I do. That must be part of what I'm committed to, because it's just part of life. I'm not saying, you know, to give the famous skeptical example, I don't believe really that there's any doubt about the world outside these doors having disappeared in the last 5 seconds. I mean, maybe theoretically it's possible, but I firmly believe that it hasn't, and I don't talk about that normally, unless there's a disagreement. Only then do I talk about that. And this ground, that's the area to which Wittgenstein refers as certainty. The things that are simply beyond dispute, not because they can't be doubted, not because they cannot be doubted or because there can't be skepticism about them, but because they are not doubted. It's a simple fact that's all that matters. People don't doubt it at the moment. You can put it into doubt. If you like, well, then people will doubt it. Then they will debate it. But there's a whole lot of things that people do not debate because there's no reason to debate it. For example, whether the universe outside the door has disappeared. No reason to debate it, so you don't debate it, and so on. That area, there's a consensus. But once you have a conversation and you explicitly talk about an issue, then you run into this problem, because the moment you have a conversation, you have disagreement, both sides try to occupy the higher ground, and that happens by producing either a universal definition, saying this is what it is, and it's then supposed to be universal, and the other side criticizes it, and then you wind up with anything goes. And that's an artifact of a debate that takes place in a contested setting where people aren't patient enough to try and figure out what the other side actually has going for it when it says X, Y, and Z, because they just can't stand hearing to who without the M, so to speak.
Okay, so we have a couple of follow-up questions. Judith and
this is more to Nancy, to Nancy's example about the mouse and the trackpad. And then your question about does it really matter? You know, we have something with a different name, similar function. Do we need to remember that there was once a mouse? And we could have other things like the way phones look today, and Walkman and things like that. I think it is important, not just for the reason that you said that, well, it's recorded. We also think outside of the textbooks, I think. Because some of the texts got lost, and some of the things did happen orally or emotionally or in other ways. And for history, I tend to call it impasses in history. The kinds of stuff that haven't, the kind of debates intellectual history in particular, that haven't come down to us, that don't define who we are. And hence we tend to ignore them conveniently. But I think all the things that even do define us, and here I come back to the vantage point that human being is speaking and thinking from, is also formed by all the things, the debates that happened in parallel, and some of them died out and some of them have survived, but the others have helped form and shape whatever has come down to us. So I think also for that reason, even if we don't see it, even if it doesn't record it, so yes, I think it does matter. Yeah.
And
Thanks. I think what I'm saying has to do with this conversation. So I really appreciated your attempt to recuperate self-ascription, and I working in South Asia and the ways in which South Asian Islam can be configured. I really appreciate and share your sense of urgency about this issue, about who gets to define what is Muslim. But I guess one thing that I think might enhance your description of, or your assessment and engagement with this idea of self-ascription would be to put it back in a social context. I mean, there's a social life of self-ascription. So all of these are very much kind of the individual in isolation, and then the job is done. And this is where Judith Butler can be really helpful. I hate being the person in the room bringing up Judith Butler because I'm not a specialist on Judith Butler, so full disclosure on that point. But just because of the notion of performance, right, and the fact that, so in her case it's gender that she's interested in, how gender is performed. But what she's very good at articulating is the ways in which there are multiple kinds of performances that are available to people. Some of them imposed on them, some of them, there are measures of choice within those performances, but there are also limits, right? And so the social life of self-ascription, the social life of the choices and non-choices that we make is there, and it's real, right? And she focused on the contemporary period, so she talks about exactly the dynamics that you're speaking about, right? This closing down, this refusal, right? The police officer effect that she talks about, right? That the limits, right? So I guess that I think might be useful to you in conceptualizing how you can understand these dynamics that you're seeing and that we're seeing on the ground, but still giving self-ascription a place, because it is really important, but that doesn't mean it's always accepted.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes. Yes, please.
Binary problem. Right, so this is for Nils, and it's a comment and then a question. The comment is that it strikes me in some ways that the project on which you're embarking seems much more like a deconstruction than a dialectic, at least insofar as, if Constantin's assessment is right, you want to have these two different poles, which are normally taken as binary opposites, to show the way each one is inhabiting the other. And this seems to always be the case. And in fact, even when you've often used the term dialectic to explain the relational properties of these, but it doesn't seem to be as though it's working, at least in a Hegelian sense, in a teleological way. It seems to be that it is really a deconstruction that's at work. You do evoke Derrida. So I would wonder about your thoughts on that. But the other is I wonder, or I want to know about your commitment to the use of White's tropes, and in particular to tragedy. And this may be an issue with Scott and not with you. But as I understand it, the opposite of romance for White isn't tragedy, but it's in fact satire. So in the romance, you have the triumph over evil. And in the satire, people are captives and resign themselves and they die. Whereas in tragedy, you have this transformative narrative, I mean in White at least, of a hero when there's a fall or a test, and they learn through resignation and work to work within the limitations of the world, and they overcome this, and the audience learns too. And so that it seems to work with Scott in the Marxist sense, the revolutionary sense, but I wasn't clear whether that was actually what you were going for. So I would like to know about your commitment to the tragic, or are you trying to define it in a slightly different way? How much do you need it actually for the argument you're trying to put forward?
Thank you.
Actually, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So about the dialectic and Hegel and Derrida, I'm not a specialist in Hegel or Derrida, full disclosure. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's not a dialectic that is geared towards sublation of this tension, but the tension is precisely at the core of his analytic, and it is precisely kept at all times, and that makes it situated universalist in my argument. And that runs against these teleologies of modernization theory or heroic stories of overcoming, because they interrupt this, what Scott then, and that leads also to the second point, this identification of time with history in 20th century theories of politics, of political change in Marxism, in liberalism. So like the end of history, modernization, development, the end of tradition, the overcoming of tradition, or the overcoming of modernity in the Arab context, or the overcoming of modernity through authenticity, for example. So this what I'm trying to get at with Scott is in this romantic narrativization of change is this heroic overcoming, leaving behind, making a cut with the past, and that has also a history in the modern imagination of history, right? This imagination of a cut between the past and the present, and it is connected to these heroic narratives of overcoming. And Derrida and others, that in this debate on the politics of time, like Agam, but also others, I think they break with this identification of history with time. And that's what Scott, in my reading, is getting at, that they develop this sensibility of this, that this is can no longer be taken as given, but we have to reckon with it. And that's what I'm trying to, with Scott, always to think with, you have to reckon with, it's not that the master narratives are past and beyond, and we are beyond that. That would be another, this is strangely romantic, heroic story of postmodern overcoming of the modern. They're still with us, and they are always renewed attempts and practices of grounding the social in such romantic narratives. And Laroui's take disrupts exactly this identification of history and time, this Hegelian form of dialectics. So you have different forms of dialectics. So either you do dialectics in a way that abolish difference, or the difference as a problem, and conflict, dissensus, or it brings out conflict and dissensus. So, for example, in the way how people define a certain word with Rancière, when they say the word Islam, and they have different understandings of that. And I think this is precisely where Laroui gets at, that inserts conflict in this very point. And there I think then the tragic is a way of saying, in my reading of Scott, that when time is out of joint, or thought of as out of joint, and you resist this identification of history and time, then how to think actually about historicity? What kind of narratives of the social should we work with? Like ways of relating a certain past with what present, with what future? Build on which models? And the problem of using models came up in a number of papers already. So I think this problem is more generally. And so in the tragic mode is resisting a quick answer to say, yeah, well, we have ready to hand here the model. It's directly ready to hand my inspiration or this model. But this thinking with, and thinking with means not overcoming the enemy, like Western hegemony, but thinking with, like how Laroui at one point says, well, it is difficult to talk about your own tradition in the words of the former colonizer, but we have to do it. There's no way around it. And it's hard, but if we don't do it, we lose, then our defeat will be even deeper. So in order to cope with our situation, we have to do it anyways. So it's like a Moroccan intellectual once called it catastrophic optimism. So I think this this is captured by Scott's discussion of the tragedy. I hope it's
Helge is.
Just a small thing, because I'm trying to understand what you're saying, Nils, but I think my problem is I can't see what you mean when you say identification of history with time. Is that temporalization of history, or is it something? And what time is history identified with? I just don't, and that makes it harder for me to understand what you're arguing, just because I don't see what that identification is, basically.
Okay, so this I take that formulation from Scott, but how I understand it is that if your account of the social is, for example, relies on modernization, classical modernization theory, which is still influential, like, you know, building democracy in Iraq or in Morocco. And then you have a certain way of establishing a relation between the past, the present, and the future, like, you know, a model of Western history that serves as a model, as a point, the foundational point, to read history. Like, and from there you read then the Moroccan present as a past, as a present that is lagging behind. This is the classical story and the critique of modernization theory. So, and there, that implies a certain way of historicizing the world around you, right? When you look from Berlin or New York to the south in this way, you identify history, like the course of things, with a certain way of relating a past with present and the future. And that is, so you can't, in a way, when you really stick to this model of historicizing, it is difficult to imagine other ways of historicizing. And Chakrabarty in Provincializing Europe makes this point that this vision of a certain mode of historicizing the world is a crucial element of the conceptual apparatus of modernity. So it's very difficult to escape from this language of spread of modernity, of the logic of the not yet, of the waiting room of history, of the non-West. It's very, because it's material practices that inform our everyday academic speech practices, so to say.
Funding practices. Funding practices.
Yeah, as well. The new, the innovative, and so on. So, what would be a way to historicize differently? So when you don't buy into modernization theory, but reckon with the fact that modernization theory is a powerful way of historicizing the world, then you distance yourself from that mode of historicizing, of a certain way of establishing relations between past, present, and futures, and try to imagine other ways of making these relations. And then I think, you know, history and time get disidentified in that sense, because time is not locked into a certain way of historicizing. Is that a bit clearer?
But that means that you relate history only to a very particular way of historicizing as it happens in modernization theory. So even within the Western theory, you marginalize quite a lot of ways of thinking about the past. Identifying history, historization, and modernization theory.
Well, I was just making an example, and I would say with Chakrabarty that this certain, what he calls historicism, Laroui has another concept of historicism, is a very powerful mode of historicizing the world in modern contexts, in modern nation states. It has, as you say, it informs funding practices and informs the humanities, you know, and ways of about, you know, bringing up Islam within the framework of the humanities. I'm not saying that, you know, that this is always the thing, like, I'm not saying that this is then everything about modernity, but it's powerful ways of historicizing that an intellectual like Laroui has to cope with. And also in my work, when I read him, these modes of historicizing non-Western intellectual productions, I really had to work my way through the powerful effects of these reading practices to actually read some difference into Laroui's works, because otherwise you would just seem like a modernizer who says, well, liberalism is so influential, so let's get liberalism, and that's the end of the story.
Can I say something to follow up on that? I think that one of the ways to keep it clearly in mind why this is so powerful a way of thinking is that if historically I'm well enough informed, it comes out of an early modern period in which people were not able to maintain consensus. It comes out of a world of religious war in which it proved impossible to establish religious peace without changing the terms of the debate, instituting sovereignty and instituting the difference between the private and the public sphere. At best, that's like a truce. But the underlying conflict between Protestants and Catholics and everybody who was engaged in that was never resolved. And the institution of violence, of sovereignty, is a violent act. It's the institutionalization and the petrification, if you like, of a religious form of violence that was never successfully pacified. And that still hovers over the whole modern world. And that's why the whole modern world so desperately needs to hang on to this difference between public and private and state and religion. And it needs to hang on to that, because the moment you give up those distinctions, all hell is going to break loose, literally speaking. Religious war is going to come back. All hell is going to break loose. If you give up on that, then where are human rights going to be? Where is democracy going to be? That's what makes this, as far as I'm concerned, in the European context, that's what gives it this power. It's an unspoken fear that lies underneath these concepts and these distinctions.
Can I answer Anne's question?
Sure, please.
Anne, thank you for that recommendation. That'll be extremely useful. One of the things I wanted to do was actually look a little bit at the act of self-ascription, because the assumption has been, well, if it's self-ascription, then anything goes. But, how many, do any non-Muslims in the room want to stand up and say, I'm a Muslim right now? No, because we're socially situated. And self-ascription is a socially, contextually situated act, so that's very helpful, and that makes me think also that I'm not sure that this is about the binary of an essence versus an anything goes. That precisely because not anything goes when it's self-ascription, it grows out of that competition of the sectional interest, and grows out of that reemergence of the past as it's been maybe frozen and then taken up again.
Okay, so Sean has a follow-up question.
Yeah, I just wonder in terms of the difference between self-ascription and ascription, which you kind of bring together very quickly in the conclusion, right, by talking about Islamic history as a category that is a reflection of the processes of self-ascription. And, when we start talking about it in terms of social situations, and we start talking about the political stakes of these self-ascriptions and ascriptions, I wonder if it's important to maintain that distinction more precisely, right? So, when I look at the move that you make, where you sort of say, okay, what makes, and I'm going to totally butcher the pronunciation of these things, what makes Hui and Muslims and Qingjin and Islam equivalent? That's not self-ascription, right? That's ascription. And what are the kind of political stakes of your making that move in the context of the discussions about state suppression and things that you've been talking about, right, which are part of the stakes of the creating of these histories of, and so somebody who's really sympathetic with your frustration about the, Balkans to Bengal, or even, let's say, Morocco to Malaysia hegemony, I'm also, one of the people who's really skeptical about the value of Islamic history, precisely because it strikes me as that it helps erase, or it helps disguise, right, precisely these kinds of stakes, right, the stakes around that act of ascription, and all of the things that can possibly be left out of that. So I guess I just want to know more about, when is ascription justified, right? And what are the politics of that, as separate from the politics and the ability to narrate and construct histories of self-ascription?
Let me just actually add a quick comment. When you asked the question, well, who among us would say whether you're a Muslim or there are many of us who would go walk sideways. So there is not an easy question. So.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, the distinction between self-ascription and ascription is important in two ways. The one you mentioned, and also, you know, I took Barth as a starting point, and he's very clear that he's not just talking about self-ascription, but also ascription as those two things interact. And I just didn't want to take the time and space in that paper to struggle with that. But there's another kind of ascription that you're talking about, which is more problematic, which is where did that word equivalent come from? That's a tough question. You know, most of us would accept that Musulman and Muslimun or something like that, or Muslim are equivalent. But why? Where does that come? Or where does it come from that when I say Muslim and you say Muslim, those are considered to be equivalent? And the answer I'm trying to explore in this paper is that it is through the process of transmission, through that I'm not saying it's, or I'm trying not to be the one who's saying that it's equivalent, but rather that you can see that the actors themselves see it as equivalent over time through the transmission. You can see the moment where the man who coins Qingzhen for Islam coins it and does so as an equivalent, and then passes on the notion that it's equivalent to his children, and they pass it on. They pass it on from there. Let me add briefly one other thing. I also sympathize with your desire to just throw away the idea of Islamic history. I'm equally excited about throwing away the idea of Chinese history. It's equally China is a super problematic category, but we have to talk to the outside world, and if we as scholars who dedicate our lives to understanding these various parts of the world want to have a voice in what happens to the people we study or the communities we come from, then we have to. I'm afraid we're stuck. I mean, getting rid of the idea of Islamic history or getting rid of the idea of China is just it's not. I can't do it. So I want to find a more reasonable way to use those terms.
Okay, Emily.
Oh yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for your presentations. Around the topic of romance and tragedy, I just want to bring out an included person from that conversation, which is Northrop Frye, the old school formalist critic, who was the origin of those modes in literary thinking, and then it migrates to Hayden White, and then it migrates to David Scott, and then it migrates to post-colonial theory. But when you go back to Frye, he's got, I mean, it's very schematic, which is why we've sort of left Frye in the dust in a lot of ways, but you know, there's low mimetic tragedy. I'm just looking at the Wikipedia. High mimetic tragedy, irony, comedy, satire, and they all sort of revolve around the individual's relationship to society and how those relationships occur. So I wonder if actually assessing the sort of literary critical past could help us thinking about the ways that these different Islamic thinkers, so just maybe even resuscitating more modes beyond romance and tragedy, which is where Scott certainly is. Are there other things from Frye that we could think with? Yeah.
Would anyone like to address this?
Yeah, thank you. I think, you know, like, I agree with you, and like for my paper, this was like the limited purpose, and I thought for this paper because this came up, like, it made sense for me to use these two types, because, but I totally agree with you that also, like, the question how to, I think it's very useful to think with these forms of literary criticism, and to think more about this, how also theory is always articulating a narrative, and also like a form of narrativization as a form of grounding one's account of the social. That then, you know, and maybe that, if I may, like this question, time and history, like if you, like the point I was trying to get at also maybe from another angle is when you frame the present within empty homogeneous time, that is the product of what Chakrabarty calls the modern nation state and historicism, then that supports this romantic narrative of overcoming, and it disables the conflict or the dissensus within the present, because the present is, modernity is then, or Islamic, the Sunnah is this reified thing traveling unchanged through time. Whereas the tragic mode disrupts this flattening of time in theological modes of understanding the Sunnah, and also in secular liberal modes of understanding tradition. That's what I wanted to get at, like a very, so not like a wholesale critique of saying, well, modernity is that, but it's a very definitive target of that Laroui has, and also my paper. And so, but yeah, I totally agree with you. That makes, thank you.
Okay, so actually, I have a, is it connected? And, yeah? Okay. So this is actually going a slightly different direction, but it's just reflecting on all the papers today. So one of the very interesting things is that multiple times we have talked about the relationship between history and politics and identity and the power structures that are completely imbued in any kind of production of the past, right? But one of the striking thing is that when we talk about modern context, like in these two papers or in other previous ones too, and also when something modern is brought up, such as, for example, what is happening in Syria right now or in Xinjiang, we are very well aware of the weight on us as moral agents talking about this, right? But when we talk about the pre-modern, like, for example, Rashid ad-Din, or if we're talking about Ibn Asakir, or, and this is partly, and because my own work is on the pre-modern too, there's a way in which the politics is completely defanged. We can just wish it away. So my question actually is for someone like Laroui, who actually wants to take up the double burden as a moral agent, as a Muslim, and as a modern historian, and a modern theoretician, when he reads the medieval authors, is he reading them fundamentally differently than anyone working in the kind of Euro-American academy would do? Is that part of the takeaway from the position he's taking? Because it then requires an entirely different way, different type of moral relationship to the sources that we are reading.
So you're asking me whether he is in a different relationship to these sources. I would say yes, and well, that's always easy to say yes and no, but let me try. His location is definitely different because he has always been writing most of his time. He was shortly in Los Angeles teaching there in the late 60s, but mostly he has taught and written in Morocco and has been concerned with debates and discourses in Morocco and the Arab world. And I think that, in terms of material location, makes a difference on his work and the audiences to which he's spoken and the languages he has written in. Like his early work was partly translated into English. His later work, books on concepts in Arabic, have mostly not been translated. And his location, for example, is not, if you wish, post-colonial in the sense that he's trying to decolonize Western theory about Islam or the Middle East. So he's very explicit in his difference from Said, for example. So he speaks as a Muslim, but he's addressing other audiences. He's addressing a Muslim and Arab audience in Morocco primarily and the wider Arab region. And he's calling for a rereading of the tradition by invoking this tradition, but while critiquing it. But by insisting on the particularity of his location within Morocco and the particular requirements that has been trying to work out, or he's emphasized that starting with his first book where he's said, well, we have to adapt Marxist theory to this particular location of contemporary Arab thought after 1967. and have to adapt our conceptual apparatus to that. That it's not fundamentally different in the sense, when people say postcolonial scholars because they are teaching in the US, that's kind of delegitimizes their project. I don't find that convincing because it kind of exoticizes location or so. So when he speaks as a situated, or what I call from a situated universalist perspective, of course he doesn't say I'm not talking to anyone beyond Morocco or beyond or non-Muslim audiences. Mm-hmm. So he's taking up this attitude of Ibn Khaldun, or that he of fiqh, of this relativizing of the absolute, that he traces, and there he establishes kind of continuity through his reading of history that goes beyond the foundational moment of the Islamic tradition to Thucydides, and so he doesn't say there was a moment of inception of this epistemic attitude. Mm-hmm. And yeah, maybe I'll leave it like that.
Yeah,
maybe.
I mean that I think that helps. But I think there is a part of the reason I'm asking is this, that thinking about his theoretical side of his discussion of historiography, time, etc. It is very rich and is very potent, and I kind of agree with Ethan that it's more deconstructionist perhaps than certainly Hegelian dialectics. But one of the interesting things is that one goes from there to reading his actual readings of certain sources. They tend to be not as exciting. So it's almost like the theory is waiting for it to be taken up. But because it's not translated, it's only in Arabic, essentially a little bit in French as well. But there is a way in which, if it can be taken up by those who do read the Arabic sources, unlike the way he does it, I think there's more potential there for further exploration.
Could I follow up on that question about responsibility, which I can't address in an Islamic context, but I certainly can address it in a European context, because I would say that I bristle when medieval people are called medieval, because they didn't call themselves medieval for obvious reasons. There were no Middle Ages. And because the term medieval, even though historians, of course, don't tend to use it that way, but the term medieval has associations with barbaric. And thank God it's no longer, it's medieval. That's what people say in ordinary language. That's medieval. So in speaking about the Middle Ages, I find there is a certain injustice that is being done to people who are long dead and whose right to be recognized as our equals is thereby violated. I feel that, because my responsibility as a historian is to understand them and to describe them fairly. That's the one side. However, the other side is that once I have understood them, I also need to say what they did when I write their history. And when I describe what they did and write the history of what they did, I cannot talk about it in their terms. As well as I may understand them, I have to use my own. So I can understand what they may have meant when they said, God wants it, and we are rescuing the Holy Land from the infidels. There's a sense in which I can understand that. But I can't repeat that. I can't say, well, in the Middle Ages, the Crusaders, they went to the Holy Land to rescue it from the infidels. I have to describe this differently, as an unprovoked act of aggression on Muslims, on Islam, on the Middle East, on whatever you want to call it, and then there's going to be a specific debate about what you really want to call it. So I would say that the point that Rush-Fries made in this paragraph, with these couple of paragraphs with which I started, applies to history as well. This is how history goes on too. There are real disagreements which divide the times. And what was legitimate to say at one point is no longer legitimate at another. And some people, I mean, this happens in a lifetime, and some people suddenly wake up to find out that what they used to say is no longer quite permissible, and they better learn to speak a little differently in the present. That's where a real disagreement occurs. And I'm not sure that I would say that's where it doesn't work, because that's part of living in society. I don't think that my point of view, my stand is there is no such thing as a Hegelian synthesis. And if you can't find one, that doesn't mean that things don't work. That means that you have a live conversation in which people talk with each other, and you say this and I say that. That's how a live conversation works. We don't say the same thing. Once we have reached saying the same thing, we might as well stop talking. That's how it ends. That's the synthesis, I suppose, when you stop talking. But who wants to do that, especially in an academic setting?
However, on that note, we have to stop talking. It's almost the end of the panel. Thank you.